Well, good morning, everyone. And welcome, as always, to our friends who are taking the course on the internet. This is Princeton's course in Civil Liberties. In my very first lecture, I told you, I promised, that we would, over the course of the semester, be discussing some of the most controversial and difficult issues that we face in American society. And I assured you that these would be issues on which reasonable people of goodwill can and do disagree. This week we turn to questions of embryo research, research involving the destruction of human embryos, abortion, and infanticide. And these issues are excellent examples of issues on which reasonable people of goodwill can and do disagree. They are issues on which I myself have strong opinions and about which I've published, issues I've discussed for the entirety of my 33 years as a professional academic. They are issues that I discuss with my colleagues here at Princeton and in the broader intellectual culture. And I know from my own experience, as a matter of empirical fact, reasonable people of goodwill very often disagree with me. And they are kind enough to suppose that in disagreeing with me, they are disagreeing with a reasonable person of goodwill. There are probably no issues that have been more divisive in American society in your lifetime than the issues that we're going to be discussing today. They're at the heart of what is sometimes called the culture war in the United States, or more recently people describe it as the cold Civil War. And yet war is a very problematic analogy, at least it should be. It should be for anyone who does agree that whatever one's views on the issue are, these are issues on which reasonable people of goodwill can and do disagree. Despite the disagreement, just about everybody across the spectrum, and it's probably fair to say that there are not just two sides here. There are a range of possible views. There are a range of views held by reasonable people of goodwill. But what people almost universally agree on is that the issues are profoundly important. From just about anyone's perspective, the issues are fundamental questions of justice and human rights. They may perceive it and do perceive it differently when it comes to the question of whose rights or where the cause of justice, the true cause of justice is. Advocates of legal abortion very often say this is a question of the fundamental human rights of women as equal human beings. And just as often, opponents of abortion say that it's a question of justice and human rights for the weakest, most vulnerable members of the human community, those not yet born or waiting to be born. And we can and should acknowledge that these are issues on which reasonable people of goodwill disagree without supposing that that means there is no truth of the matter. Now, it's possible one position is that there is no truth of the matter. Some people are general moral skeptics. They don't think that there's any such thing as moral truth, so they think that it's a mistake for anyone to claim that this or that is a matter of justice and human rights, that those moral categories, justice, human rights, don't correspond to any reality. And then there are other people who say, well, perhaps general moral skepticism isn't true, but there are some issues, and perhaps these are among those issues, on which reasonable people of goodwill can and do disagree because there's no truth about them. It's less common than it was perhaps a decade ago to hear people say this, but you still occasionally hear people say, especially when it comes to issues like the ones that we have on the table today, well, I have my truth, and you may have your truth. But that itself, of course, is a very controversial position. Most of the advocates and partisans on both sides of the issue reject that moral skepticism, whether general or particular to these issues or some other set of issues. They believe that the question really is a question of justice, a question of human rights. Those who advocate for legal abortion, and often it's public funding, say that that's a human rights issue, a women's fundamental human rights issue. There's a morally correct answer to it. Women should be free to terminate pregnancies and assisted if necessary, if they can't afford the cost of the abortion themselves, they should have available to them public funding. And people on the other side say, no, it's a matter of justice and human rights that the unborn child be protected. In opposing abortion, we stand, they say, for the fundamental human rights of the unborn child as a moral truth. So if we're to come down one way or another on the question of whether there's a moral truth of the matter, quite apart from where we think it is, if we're to come down one way or the other, that too should be decided on the basis of reasons and arguments, the best reasons and arguments that are available. Now, I mentioned already, as if you didn't know, that I myself have written about these issues. I've assigned one of my writings to you this afternoon, or for this afternoon's discussions, or the discussions this week in Precept. And yet, I recognize, as I think all professors should recognize, that my job, our job, is not to persuade you as students to join my team or come over to my side or see it the way I see it. I think professors make a grave error when they become, in their classroom work, advocates of one view rather than another on issues on which reasonable people of goodwill disagree. The professor's job, the university's job, is not to tell you or anyone else what to think. We can do that in our advocacy. We can be advocates in other contexts. I certainly am. But it's not to tell you what to think. It's to help and encourage you to think about these profoundly important issues more carefully, more deeply, more critically. And part of the work of doing that is to make sure that you have available to you the very best arguments that have been made by the very best advocates, the very best thinkers on the competing sides of the question. And that's what I've tried to do for you in the readings today. So your readings include Professor Peter Singer from Princeton, in his famous article, Why Killing Babies Isn't Always Wrong, his defense of not only abortion but infanticide. Michael Paulson, the law professor's critique, vigorous, very aggressive critique of Roe versus Wade and the regime of legal abortion that it represents. Naomi Wolf's very anguished, famous 1995 essay, Our Bodies, Our Souls. An interesting pro-choice argument that includes rather powerful and direct criticisms of her fellow pro-choice advocates, whom she thinks have abstracted from some of the most important moral questions. And then, of course, there is the exchange between Professor Michael Sandel of Harvard and myself over questions having to do with the biological and moral status of the developing human embryo. that debate is not directly about abortion at all. The debate came out of work that Professor Sandel and I were doing together as members of the President's Council on Bioethics, on which we served from 2002 to 2009, agreeing on a great many bioethical issues, but disagreeing on the question of whether the government should fund research involving the destruction of human embryos or under what circumstances it should fund, with me making the case for the moral standing and inviolability of human embryos as human beings and indeed persons, and with Professor Sandel making the argument for the permissibility of embryo destructive research and its government funding on the ground that while human embryos weren't properly classified as mere things or objects but had a certain moral standing, they weren't yet persons and could therefore, under certain circumstances, Sandel argues in the piece that you have read or will read, under certain circumstances, can be used in research that promises to help, perhaps bring cures, to persons who suffer from dreaded ailments. Now, again, in laying before you the very strongest arguments that have been made by the most serious thinkers on competing sides of the issue, I don't mean to suggest to you that there is no truth. And there's also a danger in what I've done. Human nature is such that we tend to do two things that are problematic intellectually. One of those things is to wrap our emotions very tightly around our convictions. And these issues are highly emotional issues. People have not only strong opinions, but strong feelings about these issues. And that, combined with the second problematic thing, really creates an issue. The second problematic thing is a tendency we human beings have to tribalism. Amy Chua, the Yale law professor who became famous for her book on tiger mothers, has a new book out. It's a very powerful critique of the human tendency to tribalism, which she thinks is responsible for a lot of the polarization that we see now, culturally, politically, morally, not only in our own country, but really across the West and even more broadly. So not only do we wrap our emotions tightly around our convictions, sometimes so tightly that we fall into a kind of dogmatism, but we also tend to adopt views that are the views that make us fit in best with our group or our friendship circle or people like us or people in our clan or tribe or people in the communities that we would like to have access to or that we would like to retain our standing in. So being pro-choice makes me a one of these rather than a one of those. Being pro-life makes me a one of those rather than a one of these. And when you are cognizant of the fact that reasonable people of goodwill do disagree about these issues, and you have available to you very strong arguments by very powerful thinkers on the competing sides, it's easy to fall into the trap of simply adopting as your own the strongest argument for the position that you already hold or that you hold because it's what people like me believe, or it's what people in my tribe or group or clan or class or friendship circle or community believe. And what makes it very difficult to avoid falling into that trap is that the truth of the matter is that one can become alienated from, one can be made an outsider by adopting positions on these types of hot-button, emotionally charged questions that are out of whack with my political party, the political party to which I usually give my allegiance, or my friendship circle, or those with whom I generally agree ideologically, or those in my class or in my clan or in my group or in my friendship circle. if you'll indulge me a little bit of autobiography, I'm thinking back to when I was sitting where you're sitting, not here at Princeton, but just an hour or so away at Swarthmore College when I was an undergraduate. And someone who already had strong opinions about things that I had not earned by actually thinking my way into them very often. But I had them nonetheless, as many of my classmates did. And looking back, I see how often, when my professors did me the courtesy of making available to me powerful arguments for competing points of view, how often I fell into the trap of just latching on to what I thought was the best argument for what I already believed, or believed because I liked being part of the group that did believe these things, but which I hadn't actually adopted because I had thought the thing through, considered the arguments on the competing sides of the question, and then genuinely, sincerely made a decision about where I thought the truth was to be found. It was the experience of reading an ancient Greek, Plato's dialogue Gorgias. If some of you read the Gorgias, perhaps in your philosophy classes or classics courses, it was in reading the Gorgias that the light bulb went off over my head, where Plato leads us to understand that we should believe what we believe because of a sincere engagement with the arguments, the best arguments and counter-arguments advanced on the subject. And that we should be willing to follow the logic, the reasons, the evidence, the arguments, wherever they led, even if they led us out of where we were into some new and perhaps uncharted territory. And even if they would have the effect of making us outsiders where we were once insiders. So while it's not my job to tell you what to think, and I won't do that, I do want to encourage you as strongly as possible to think your way to your conclusions on these issues and on all issues on which reasonable people of goodwill disagree. Don't just look for the best argument that will support the position I already hold, or that I have strong feelings about, or that keeps me on the inside of that group, or would enable me to be on the inside of that group. And by group, I don't mean just some little group. I mean the kind of community of people who think this way or that way. It's important for us to think our way and to follow the argument wherever it leads, acknowledging one's own fallibility. There's a certain sense in which our opinions at the end of the day, no matter how strongly we hold them, and no matter how convinced we are on the basis of true rational inquiry, there's a certain sense in which our opinions remain tentative if our minds remain open, if we're willing to continue to engage and listen to arguments and counter-arguments. That doesn't mean that you're not a person of conviction. Your willingness, anyone's willingness, to be open to arguments, to the possibility of changing one's view or one's position, even where one had strongly held a view. That doesn't make you a convictionless person. But it does, I think, make you someone who does value truth as best you can get it over opinion, or group membership, or feeling, or emotion. And I think universities can and should and do promote that among students. Now, I mentioned the emotional nature of these kinds of issues, and especially the issues that we're touching on today, and most especially the issue of abortion. And that raises the need for a kind of sensitivity in the discussion as well as openness. Yes, discussion should be robust, and yes, it should certainly be civil. But without compromising the need for robust discussion, we have to recognize that these are issues that actually touch people's concrete lives. And so in discussions of abortion, one needs to be cognizant that, especially in large groups or in public dialogue, public discussion, one is probably speaking in a group that includes women who've had abortions, some of whom perhaps believe that the availability of an abortion was what saved their lives, that they would have been in a disastrous situation had they been required to carry a child to term. And it may also include women who deeply regret an abortion or feel that they were deceived or misled about what abortion actually is and whether there's a human life or abortion is a taking of a human life. The discussion is likely to include husbands, boyfriends, parents, friends who have counseled women or supported women or sometimes encouraged women to have abortions or not have abortions. The discussion might include, I've certainly been in discussions that included people who felt very strongly that abortion was wrong and shouldn't be permitted, or at least permitted generally, because they feel that they are the kind of person who would have been vulnerable to an abortion had it been available, or by luck had a decision gone the other way, because let's say they're cognitively or physically disabled in some way, or because they were unwanted and grew up as adopted children. The most passionate advocate of the pro-life position on our own campus, in my experience, is a professor here who was an adopted child. And that experience of being adopted and this sense that he barely escaped the modern abortion law with his life has turned him into a very passionate defender of the pro-life position. There's also, of course, those rare cases, but they exist. I've been with people, in the two cases I can think of, both happen to be women, although that, in this, for purposes of this discussion, is especially relevant, who survived abortions in the sense that they were the children, in these cases the daughters, of mothers who sought abortions. An abortion was attempted, the abortion failed, and they were born alive. One very badly disabled, the other, I think, at least physically, okay. But this explains the real sensitivities that people have on these questions. And I think we rightly perceive the need for a kind of sensitivity in the discussion without compromising on its robustness, without trimming whatever one's position is. The need for sensitivity in discussion